Good morning, guys, and welcome to this fourth lecture. Today, we are going to discuss another normative school, rather, two normative schools, virtue ethics and ethics of care. Virtue ethics or ethics and ethics of care, they are different from other normative schools, including schools of consequentialism and schools of non consequentialism. As I told you in the beginning, virtue ethics and ethics of care do not focus on individual actions. They are not concerned about judging what is a right action as opposed to what is a wrong action. Rather, it focuses on what makes you a good person, what makes you a person of good character, what makes you virtuous. That would be the question that is asked by the virtue ethics. And the ethics of care would slightly modify that and ask, what makes you a loving, caring person? So basically, to be a good person, to be a person of virtue, is the focus of virtue ethics. So we have this famous statement by William Frankena, who says, principles without virtues are impotent, and virtues without principles are blind. What he wants to say is that both are important in ethics. Both go hand in hand. We need some norms, some normative principles to guide our actions, but also we need to practice good virtues so that we remain people of good character. So one without another is not helpful. They are not mutually exclusive. Now, let us discuss first the virtue ethics. It has a teleological origin. Now, what do we mean by teleology? Telos is a Greek word which means the end, the goal, or the purpose. So, virtue ethics is built on this premise that life has purpose. Every life has purpose, not only the human life, every life has purpose. And that purpose, attaining that purpose, is the highest good, is the summum bonum. So we need to constantly strive towards fulfilling that purpose, to reach that purpose. The purpose of human life for Aristotle is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is often translated in English as happiness, but a better translation would be the overall human flourishing. So, as a human, what makes you to flourish in every possible way? What makes you to be cheerful? What makes you happy? Aristotle would say, you can be happy if you act in accordance with your reason. So, reason is that which helps you to know what kind of life you should lead. If you listen to your reason and you lead your life accordingly, then you would get this eudaimonia, this overall human flourishing. And that is the end goal of human life, the purpose of your life. So, according to Aristotle, it is the life of reason that enables you to lead a virtuous life. Because virtue, after all, is a life of happiness, and the happiness is basically an activity of the soul which is in total agreement with virtue. Now let us try and understand what a virtue is. Aristotle says virtue is your ability to act or feel according to the idea of excellence? Are you able to act in the excellent way, or are you able to feel in the most excellent way possible? So, whenever you do something, are you able to do it virtuously in the most excelling way possible? Aristotle makes a distinction between intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Some of the examples of intellectual virtues are wisdom and prudence. These intellectual virtues can be taught by someone. In fact, we learn always these intellectual virtues from others, from a philosopher guide. The moral virtues like being kind, being loyal, being honest, having courage, all these things cannot be taught by someone. This is not a knowledge that someone can impart to you. You can acquire these virtues only and if only you can make it a habitual practice. So you need to constantly practice this. This is like, let's say, like swimming. Swimming is something that you need to jump into the pool so that you can start moving your arms and legs, and then you figure out how to swim. No matter how much people tell you what are the techniques involved, unless you start doing it, you will not get it. It's not the same as mathematics. Somebody teaches you mathematics, if you understand it, you get it. So that would be something equivalent to intellectual virtues. Whereas something like swimming would be an analogy. It's not the same, but it would be an analogy to moral virtues. So it is only by repeated practice. As the old saying goes, practice makes the man perfect. So moral virtues are obtained by us only by constantly cultivating it in ourselves through regular habitual practice. You cannot merely learn from some others. It doesn't mean others cannot tell you what would be a virtuous life, but the fact that others tell you does not make you to become virtuous. Aristotle also says virtue is a golden mean. It means it lies in the middle of two extremes. Now let us take for example the virtue of courage. On the one extreme we have cowardice, people who are cowardly, who run away from life's problems, risks. On the other end you will have people who are foolhardy, who will rush into problems without sufficiently thinking through it, without working out an exit strategy. Now courage is exactly in between. You are neither cowardly nor foolhardy. You act in a courageous way, and that is in the middle of these two extremes. So the question an ethicist should ask is not whether lying is right or wrong, according to Aristotle, but a person of honesty, would he lie in this situation or in this circumstance? So a person of honesty is the ideal type, is the example, is the best example, whether he would lie in this circumstance. So that would be the answer you would be wanting to seek. Now let us look at some of the merits of the virtue ethics. Now according to Aristotle, you cultivate virtue not only because it is a moral requirement for you, but that's the only way in which you can ensure that you lead a life which can be good and filled with happiness. After all, a good life is the one that should make you happy, because the end goal of your life is eudaimonia, the overall human flourishing, the happiness. It also implies that virtue ethics takes into account not only the norms but also the motives. So it doesn't merely look at the action whether they are in conformity with the norms, but it also raises the question whether it complies with the motives, right motives. Let us make a distinction between the Kantian understanding of motive and the virtue ethicist understanding of motive. Kant does give an importance to motive, but he focuses on motive or reduces motive to only one aspect, that is the motive to do the duty for duty's sake. That's the right thing to do. Virtue ethics does not think duty as the only motive. or doing the duty for the sake of duty is the only motive. It also involves other motives like acting out of kindness, of benevolence. You would do something because of friendship or out of sympathy for someone or because you deeply care for someone. All these things are important aspects of making you into a virtuous person. Now let us take this example in order that we understand the distinction. You have got an ailing grandmother. You visit her because you love her deeply. Whereas your brother visits her because he thinks it is his duty to visit her. Now you visit her not only because it's your duty, yes, it's your duty as a grandson, but you also do that because you have other motive than doing your duty, that is your love. So that would be the distinction between you acting in a virtuous way and your brother acting merely out of duty. That would be very Kantian. Your brother would be very Kantian, whereas you would be acting in a virtuous way because you have the character of loving your grandmother. You are virtuous. Now let us try to understand how does a virtue ethicist make moral decisions. Let us imagine that you practice virtue ethics very seriously in a committed way, and your friend comes and asks you in a given time that he has borrowed some loan from the bank. Now that he is not able to pay it back, that he could lie to the bank to escape from paying back the debt that he owes to the bank. Now, as a virtue ethicist, you'll have to ask some other questions to your friend who seeks your advice. Is lying something that would make you honest or dishonest? Would a dishonest person be virtuous? For example, can he show compassion and sympathy towards people who are vulnerable and who are capable of being cheated? Because in this case, your friend is trying to cheat the bank. Would that make you a person who can be compassionate to those who are capable of being cheated? Can a dishonest person contribute to the overall human happiness, the overall human flourishing? So the virtue ethicist does not reason out abstractly, but focuses on the ideal type of person. Discover from the moral example that the ideal person sits before you and says whether by answering these questions, the ideal person, if he does, then that would be okay for you. If an ideal person of virtuous character doesn't do, then it would not be okay for you. So what a virtuous person spontaneously does would be the right action. Let us now evaluate the virtue ethics. We normally evaluate every moral theory using the threefold criteria: whether it is consistent with considered moral judgments, whether it is consistent with common moral experience, whether it is useful in problem solving. Virtue ethics is definitely consistent with considered moral judgments, and it is also consistent with common moral experience. Considered moral judgments will tell us that our behavior should be virtuous. So also that is our common moral experience. We would like people to exhibit a good character, a virtuous character in their relationship with others, in the moral choices they make. But it does not help us to solve moral problems. If a poor stranger steals money from you, what would you do? Would you take him to task? Would you forgive him? After all, a virtue ethicist would tell you, do as an ideal virtuous person would do. An ideal virtuous person would be, for example, the historical Jesus or the historical Buddha. Do as Jesus or Buddha does. The argument behind this advice is whatever a virtuous person does is the right thing. Now, what is a right thing is what a virtuous person does. Who is a virtuous person? The one who does the right thing. It is a circular reasoning. It doesn't say anything new. The virtuous person is the one who does the right thing, and the right thing is what is done by a virtuous person. It doesn't say anything different or new. It repeats the same thing in different ways. Therefore, it doesn't help you to solve problems. There are also additional reasons why it is not helpful in problem solving. You may be a just person. You may be a person of great virtue, of excellent character, even a kind person. But that does not necessarily guarantee that you would be able to make a right decision about whether stem cell research is morally permissible or not. You need other information. You need other guiding norms to come to your decision about such complicated question. Or when there are conflicts between two virtues, unless otherwise there are other guiding norms, you will not be able to resolve that conflict. Now, to be loyal to your friend is a virtuous act. But at the same time, to be honest is also another virtue. Suppose if your friend has done something wrong and you are called to the court to bear witness, would you be honest, telling the truth that your friend did something wrong? Or you would be loyal to your friend as a person of virtue and end up lying to the court that he did not do it? Now, there is obviously a conflict between your loyalty to your friend and being honest. Virtue ethics does not give us any possibility to resolve this conflict. Aristotle was the founder of this virtue ethics, and the virtue ethics does not end with Aristotle, or it does not end in antiquity. Contemporary moral thinkers are fascinated about this virtue ethics, and they have renewed it in very many different ways. I'm not going into the detail about the different theories that we have, but it is important to realize there are at least quite many of them who are morally very significant in our times. We have, for example, McIntyre, who nuances Aristotle's virtue ethics and says virtues are not fixed once and for all. They evolve as society evolves through the history. So the application of the moral norms cannot ignore the context in which we live. So what is virtuous today is to be seen in today's context. What was virtuous at the time of Aristotle need not be virtuous anymore. For example, at the time of antiquity, the physical strength was a great virtue. Today, we would hardly attach importance to physical strength because the times have changed. We are no longer in a condition where we are constantly waging war against each other, at least not using our physical strength. So therefore, the virtues evolve over time through history, and therefore in the given context we need to find out what are the virtues today we need to live by. We also have Anscombe, who makes a relation between virtues and norms. Now, norms are like the laws that we have to follow. But the laws in themselves are not helpful unless we have a lawgiver. The lawgiver is the virtue. In other words, the laws are to be derived from the virtues. You cannot have laws that lack certain virtuous ability. So therefore, in as much as you cannot think of law without lawgiver, you cannot think of guiding norms without virtues to live by. Philippa Foot says the best way to make this place a better place is if all of us live by virtues. Husthouse says, though virtue ethics do not give us specific norms, there are certain guidance that we can get from what she calls the V rules. We can derive certain rules from virtues and vices. For example, if honesty is a virtue, then the rule that or the norm we would derive from that is do not cheat others. So the virtue and the vices can help us to derive some guiding norms. So they are related, they are not totally apart from one another. There are at least two things we learn from virtue ethics. In our moral experience, our character matters. To lead a life of virtue is important. That is part of our moral experience. We cannot ignore this inevitable aspect of our moral experience. Another important contribution of virtue ethics is when you look at the action, we don't merely look at the action. The motives matter. Was this person a virtuous person? Did he act out of some virtue? When somebody has done something terribly wrong, was it done out of some motive which exhibits certain virtue? Killing an innocent person who is struggling with pain. Oftentimes in euthanasia this happens. The assisted suicide. You let the person die or you give some kind of painkiller by which the person dies. In a certain way you assisted the suicide. By the action itself it may be considered wrong, but what was the motive behind it? Was it induced by your concern for the person, your love for the person, your kindness or sympathy for the person? Those things are to be taken into account. Now let us move to care ethics. Care ethics is another dimension to virtue ethics. Rather than focusing on virtues, which according to some thinkers are very much masculine in nature, this care ethics focuses on the close, intimate, personal relationships and certain virtues that accompany such relationships. Virtues like love, sympathy, and compassion. Care ethics emerged in the context of challenging the moral stages of development, a theory that was suggested by Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, in response to this research that Kohlberg has done and has come up with moral stages of development, Carol Gilligan published a famous book in a different voice. She came up with her own research to show how Kohlberg's theory of moral stages of development is lopsided. It's one-sided. It is typically male-oriented. That is why many feminist thinkers believe that this particular approach is the starting point to develop a unique kind of feminist ethics. It is debatable whether we can have feminine ethics as opposed to or as different from a masculine ethics. When it comes to morality, men and women are not all that different. Though it is debatable, we do know there is a whole streak of thinking called feminist ethics. Let us now focus on Kohlberg's theory of moral stages of development, because it is in reaction to that this Carol Gilligan developed what came to be known as ethics of care. Now, according to Kohlberg, there are three stages of moral development. The first stage is called pre-conventional. Normally, this stage is attributed to people who are of very young age, children below 10 or 12 years old. Then comes the conventional stage. The conventional stage is often associated with adolescent period or early adult period. And the post-conventional stage is associated with the adult period of human life. Now, each of these stages has further subdivisions. For example, in the pre-conventional stage, we have got two aspects. Pre-conventional stage basically implies that people act morally because of some external control that is exerted upon them. Now, there are two aspects to this. The external control that is exerted upon them might instill a fear of punishment. So, in order to avoid punishment, they may act morally. Or the external control exerted upon them may promise them some rewards if they behave morally. So, for getting rewards, they may act in conformity with the expected behavior, with the norms that are provided to them. This is what exactly children would do. For example, they would do their homework on time because they are either afraid of punishment given to them by teachers or parents, or they may expect a reward in terms of a nice fancy dress or a good dinner. So these are different ways in which they are trained normally. In the conventional stage, again you have got two substages. You act because you are seeking approval from social groups. So the social groups have some form of control over you, but now you are not fearing punishment or expecting rewards, material rewards. All that you seek is approval and recognition. So this often happens in the peer social group. When your peer group wants you to do something, you would conform to that. When they want you to behave well in public, you would do that because then only you will realize you will be part of that group. Otherwise, you think they would throw you out of the group. So you want to be part of the group, you want their approval, so you would do that. So in a little later stage, it's not only the peer group, it is to the social order. You begin to conform yourself to the social authority and the social order. What does the social order want me to do? So depending on that, you would begin to conform to that because you need the approval of the authority. So oftentimes people behave morally because they want to somehow get recognition and approval from their leaders, their bosses, their superiors, in their workplace for that matter. The post-conventional stage is where you are reaching the highest moral stage of development. You are no longer trying to avoid punishment or get reward or get approval from social groups or even get approval from social authority or social order. You are capable of independently making moral choice, thinking out of the box, not thinking from within the social order. In fact, sometimes if you have to change the existing unjust situation, we have to think outside of the social order. We cannot always conform to the social order or the social authority. Great changes in the society have come because people have challenged the social order. So you want to think that there are individual rights that are to be balanced with the social order. The social order may think, well, in this country the segregation will exist, the black will remain separate from the white. Now if you conform to that, that is not the highest moral order. You begin to say, no, individual rights matter. Social order may be helpful, but in this case, the social order is not helpful. Every human being, whether black or white, whether this color or that color, whether this economic status or that economic status, whether this caste or that caste, everybody has individual rights. So you begin to now critically think about the individual rights that people have, while you don't really throw away the social order. In the next sub-stage of the post-conventional stage, you have internalized certain convictions, certain moral principles. Justice, equality, dignity, all these things become important for you. And it is in this name of justice, equality, or dignity you begin to challenge the existing social order. So even you think sometimes you may have to break the existing social order, you may have to bring about change, even revolution if necessary. That would be the highest moral stage of development. You won't conform to the existing norms, you may challenge the norms. You remember some 2000 years ago there was a great person in history who had challenged the existing norms of the society. He belonged to this highest normal order. So he belongs to this highest, moral stage of development. Now let us evaluate the Kohlberg's theory. You have got some difficulties with this theory. Many different difficulties have come. One such difficulty is placed by Hogan. Hogan thinks this theory has a serious danger because it may lead people to place their own principles about the social norms and the social order. So that is not going to do good. If you are going to place your own principles above the social good, then that would lead to serious problem. You cannot obviously have that. So that would be one serious problem that you would have from this. You also have other problems pointed out by others. For example, you have got another important critique that is placed by Simpson, who says that this is typically a Western model. This moral stage of development may not apply to all cultures universally. This is a typical Western order, has a certain logic in which people rationalize, and this is imposed on every other culture. The third critique is the most important critique for our purpose here. It comes from Gilligan, who thinks that this is totally gender biased, because Kohlberg has come to this conclusion based on the research that he has done, but in the research he had only male participants. So it is totally male-oriented approach. He has completely ignored the female participants and their responses. Suppose if he had included the female participants, his finding would have been different. So that was her critique. And to set that right, she comes up with her own research. And what is her research? It's a thought experiment. In order to do this research, she chooses two 11-year-old children. Both are of the same background in every aspect. Social status, economic status, educational background, everything is the same. Except the fact that one is a boy, another is a girl. Amy and Jake. Now she gives a thought experiment to them. It's not a real issue, but a thought experiment, a kind of an imagined case study. Heinz is a loving husband. His wife is having a serious terminal illness. She is struggling for life. He has to buy an expensive drug to save her life, or at least prolong her life for a few weeks or few months. The drug costs $100 and he doesn't have enough money. He has got only $70 with him. So he goes and tries to buy that drug from the pharmacist, telling him he has $70, he will pay $70 now, he will pay $30 later. Could he have that medicine to save his wife? The pharmacist refuses. Now Heinz has no other go, he has no other alternative, he doesn't know what to do. Heinz finally decides that night he will break open the pharmacy and steal the drug, and maybe leave the $70 in the cash box. Was his decision to steal a right decision? If he steals, would that be a right action? Now that is a question that was posed to Jake and Amy. Think for a moment, what would you answer? Now let us come to the response of Jake. Jake's response is very clear. He says, in the first place, life is more important than property. So he argues very logically. The truth has to be sought in a logical way. Life is more important than property. Secondly, there is no other way that he could save the life of his wife, because the society is so unjust. In the first place, why is it that he doesn't have enough resources, financial resources, to save his wife? So the society is therefore not right. The existing social order is not right. Therefore, he would say, anyone who reasons this way would conclude that stealing in this case is perfectly morally permissible. Of course, in this given context, in this given circumstance, Jake doesn't say stealing as a norm is right, but in this case, it is perfectly morally permissible. So what Jake does is he differentiates a moral norm and then the existing moral act, the morality. And he says, from the existing moral act, we may have to sometimes improve upon the moral norms. Some moral laws, if they need change, we need to change them. Also, he thinks of this as a conflict between life and property, but then conflict of claims to life and claims to property. Heinz has a claim to save the life of his wife, whereas the pharmacist has a claim to own his property, which he would not like to part with without having an exchange of an equal value in terms of money. So it is only an impersonal conflict. It is not a conflict of relationship between the pharmacist and Heinz. It is merely an impersonal conflict because both have different claims to make. Amy's response is rather very different. In the first place, she is not able to think clearly. She cannot think for herself. She is very evasive in her answers. She keeps giving always evasive answers. She is not very straightforward in her thinking. She lacks confidence. She is not able to say clearly whether it is right or wrong. And when she is asked, well, then what would you do if he cannot steal? She would say, well, the pharmacist must have been kind enough to give the medicine to Heinz. So what she does is, she focuses on the aspect of relationship. She also says, well, if Heinz steals, and in case if he is caught by the police, he would not be with his wife when she needs him most, because she would be arrested and thrown into the prison. And it is at that time when she is ailing, his wife needs him the most. So again, the question of relationship comes here. So she sees this not as an impersonal conflict of claims, but rather she sees this as a dilemma that comes because the druggist has failed to respond to the need of Heinz's wife. And the problem is not logical, but the problem is one of social communication and social relationship. Now, interestingly, some studies have shown that women, they have so much emphasis and focus on social relationship. They trust social relationship so much that when they are not in social relationship, they feel very sad, unhappy. Whereas men, they don't trust so much of social relationship. In fact, they are not very happy when they are in social relationship because they are often doubting their loyalty or the loyalty of the other persons in their relationship to them. Innumerable studies have been made, so I don't need to get into that right now. But what is important for us to remember is that men and women think differently. And that is how we see the contrast between Jake and Amy. Jake sees as a conflict between life and property, and that can be resolved by certain logical reasoning. And there is a clear categorical way of proceeding in your thinking. Whereas Amy sees this as a conflict between life and the lack of communication or lack of social relationship. And the problem can only be resolved by honest, open communication and establishing good relationship. That's the only way we can resolve such moral dilemmas. Now, both are right in their own ways, but both are very different. Based on that, Gilligan would come to conclude the following. She says, Amy sees something more in the problem which Jake does not see. Like Amy, women generally have a different perspective, to think differently from men. And oftentimes women situate moral problems within the context of social relationships, which can be maintained and nurtured by open, sincere, honest communication. So, if women think that way, then women, the way they achieve the highest stage of moral development is very different from the way men achieve the highest stage of moral development. And that particular moral development which women achieve, Gilligan calls the ethics of care. Now, ethics of care, therefore, is a particular kind of perspective. It is not any specific norms or guidelines. It's a particular perspective to moral life itself that helps us to preserve and nurture relationships. And it also helps us to be attentive to the needs of others and positively respond to the needs of others when others need us. With that, I have come to conclude this particular lecture 4, virtue ethics and ethics of care. Thank you for your patient listening. I'll meet you Friday with another lecture topic on ethics. Thank you very much.